Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session on energy storage and strategic autonomy. And my name is Michel Rademacher. I'm the Deputy Director of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and I will be your moderator today. So I'm looking forward to it. We have a strong lineup, and the next 2 hours we have the opportunity to discuss the various elements of the energy transition, policies and investment strategies from both a think tank perspective, the European energy transition topics, as well as strategic autonomy angle, the industry and investment points of view, etc. We have some 160 subscriptions, so it probably turns out that we have quite some speakers and listeners today, because we have a nice lineup. I will introduce everybody during the seminar by the time that I ask everybody to speak up and take up the discussion. I'd like to first thank the French ambassador, as well as the VOTOP, the Dutch Tank Storage Association, for co-organizing this with us and having this great lineup today. The EU has set a bold and far-reaching goal to become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050, and moving from fossil fuel-based energy systems to a decarbonized energy economy is not a given. And for this to happen, we need a well-planned and integrated energy infrastructure, and at the same time, help to keep prices at check, which is, of course, given the war in Ukraine at this point, a very difficult task. The European Green Deal will require great steps, among others, the deployment of new infrastructures, such as hydrogen networks or energy storage facilities, the development of innovative technologies, and massive investment from both the private and public sectors. And the Russian aggressions against the Ukraine and its impact on energy markets accelerates the transformational change, aiming to make the EU less dependent on Russian oil and gas. So the questions for today, amongst others, are: what are the threats and opportunities that Europe has to deal with? What role could liquid energy storage play? And what should or could be the policies, both in France, the Netherlands, and in the rest of Europe, to facilitate this, while at the same time enhancing our strategic autonomy? The panel will reflect on these questions and more, and hopefully at the end of this 2-hour session, everybody is informed a bit better. Maybe some takeaways that are of use for each of you are being addressed, and that it, in the end, you could conclude that this was a useful 2 hours to spend with us. I hope that the ambassador is already available, and I think so. So welcome, Mr. Ambassador Louis Vassy. Ambassador, you are the ambassador of France to the Netherlands since May 2019, and you're also the permanent representative at the OPCW, the chemical watchdog, so to say, in Hague. And before you were stationed in the US, advisor to the Minister of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But we don't go into details on all these earlier tasks, but we are focusing today on energy storage and strategic autonomy, and I'd like to welcome you to do a short opening address, please, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me correctly?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, first of all, a big thank you to the organizers for an important event, of course, just at a moment when we are experiencing one of the gravest crises in the European continent, which has obviously a huge security and military component, but also, and I'm sure that will be part of the discussion today, an important energy aspect. The fallout of the crisis in the energy market in Europe is obviously huge, and we've been talking a lot, including in the press, about energy storage. In a way, I'm not the technician in the room, but if you allow me, I would like to share a couple of reflections on the overall topic, maybe also as the presidency of the European Union, just to say that in a way we are at a time of where we see the crystallization of what we in France have been advocating for, which is a more strategic European Union that is that reduces its level of dependencies from the outside to make sure that it can act autonomously, which means in fact freely and remain in control of its policies and of its destiny. And also the concept that this commission has been pushing of a geopolitical commission. And what we see with this crisis, which is overreaching and encompasses lots of different issues, is that security and geopolitics are in fact everywhere. Of course, they are there when you talk about defense or foreign policy. That's the obvious. But in fact, they are also there when you talk about energy, and we specifically mention energy security, or and that's not the topic of the day, but it's also an important topic when you talk about food security and agriculture. So this crisis crystallizes lots of the reflections that we've been having at the European level, debates that we have one with another, and I'm sure you'll be exploring the effect of the crisis in terms of our resilience, our ability to reduce our dependencies from the outside, and these days specifically about gas from Russia, which is the key question in this crisis, and what tools are available. So storage, there, frankly, I'm not the technician, will be part of the solution. It will be LNG, it will be imports from other sources, and our ability to store indeed to be more resilient. But I also want to flag that even though that will be certainly part of the answer in the short term, we need to be looking even now in the context of the Green Deal and in the context of our energy transitions at the longer term and at ways of drastically reducing our dependencies from the outside. Our recently re-elected president has announced during the presidential campaign its intention to make France one of the, or if not the first major economy that would become carbon free. As you know, we'll do that with a mix of renewables and development of nuclear energy. When you talk renewables, of course, you have the issue of storage of energy. So there too, it will be important. How do you introduce hydrogen in your energy policies? And that's the experience that we have, let's say, accumulated with gas, including here in the Netherlands. Does that experience help address some of the challenges in the sector of the hydrogen sector? All these will be key questions. And my last remark then on that basis would be to say that in a French-Dutch context, we are in fact, it's obvious we don't have the same energy mix. Historically, you come from a very gas-dominated energy mix. We come from a very nuclear-dominated energy mix. But for both countries, because we could rely on... Sorry, can you hear me?
We can hear you a bit.
I got a phone call on the phone. Sorry. So because we could rely on stable energy sources that were autonomous, we've developed a vision of the energy policy that is more mindful of the necessity to be autonomous, because that's our history in a way. I'm really glad that all these questions that you'll be addressing today will be in fact also part of the dialogue that we've developed between the two countries. It went a little bit unnoticed because the news are full of other things, but in the joint communique that we did between France and the Netherlands on the occasion of Prime Minister's Rutte visit to Paris, there is the announcement that we will create a joint French-Dutch working group on energy autonomy issues, and I think we have a lot to bring to the European table when we gather to see again where independence is necessary, production in the continent, where storage has a place in the end, because we all feel the urgency to reduce as soon as possible now, specifically our dependencies on Russia, but more broadly from the outside. So that would be my very short introduction, and I want to thank again the organizers and everyone that is present for this important meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and great that you were willing to open this seminar. And hopefully you can stay with us a bit longer and to follow the discussions. So thank you, and I'd like to then introduce Lucia van Geuns. Lucia van Geuns is a senior energy expert at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. She has a background in geoscience and petroleum engineering, economics and planning, and her research focuses on international energy market developments, transition issues, and climate change policy. So she promised us to give a bit broader expose to set the scene of the discussion of today. So Lucia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Michel. I'm going to share my screen. Let's hope that all going to work. And actually, do you now see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, in full screen, Michel. Great,
yeah.
Great. Well, as said, let me just put the laser pointer on. I'm going to give a bit of an, if you like, a context type of a presentation, which I think maybe sets the scene for further discussion. And that is sort of generalized with the title, The Changing Energy Landscape. And of course, you know, I can't, talk about the changing energy landscape without talking about what's happening today, as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. We see actually, because of that, if you like, aggression by the Russian in Ukraine, you see that energy security has come to the forefront. While in fact, the last couple of years, it was mainly the environment and the climate, which very much was at the forefront. But now we see that price and security of supply is also a very important part of what we call energy policies. And in fact, it should be the three of them, which in the end of the day gives a balanced energy policy. So we see that actually there has been, you know, in the last month, a roller coaster oil market. We even see the highest oil price since 2014, which was at the beginning of March, of almost $128 per barrel. We see already starting in autumn 2021 an enormous increase of our gas prices, especially European gas prices, and that also you see spikes, especially, you know, after 24 February 2021 spikes as far as gas prices, so the TTF prices is concerned in Europe, and even on the global power markets, you see that there has been they are gaining market share, and especially the Thrive governments to decarbonize and in the end of the day cut emissions, also give volatile power markets. All in all, we see that the world energy industry is about to be transformed, yes, on the long term, but on the short and mid-term, energy security is with us and is most likely here to stay. And actually, I use here the front of The Economist because this was a very interesting number where a lot on this has been described. On the other end of the stick, if you like, I mean, you have the current geopolitical and security of supply issues as far as energy is concerned. The International Energy Agency in May 2001 has issued their roadmap for the global energy sector as far as the roadmap towards a net zero energy world by 2050. And in order to achieve that net zero emissions by 2050, we need to actually completely transform the global energy system. And it gave some, if you like, it gave some highlights, like the path to net zero emission is narrow. And mind you, this particular report, which maybe some of you have read, it's very thick, it's very thorough, is a backcasting scenario. In other words, we know where we want to go to. We want to go to a world of 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase by 2100. And if we backcast this in terms of scenario modeling, then we should do this now and here. And this is May 2021. But as said, the path is very narrow. Huge leaps needs to be made in order to come to clean energy innovation and therefore shift away from fossil fuels. You also see that electricity becomes the core of the energy system. Low energy emission industries will flourish, and actually new energy technologies will be widespread by 2041. And then that last bullet is an interesting one. That is, what is the clean energy world? And that's actually a world where in the end of the day, we all love each other. That's what I often say. Greater international cooperation among countries, close cooperation between businesses, investors and citizens, and solar will be the single largest source of supply. Of course, when you read this, especially in the constellation we are currently are, you know, it is something it sounds a bit idealistic. Let's put it like that. So if we then look at the same World Energy Outlook, where also the net zero carbon scenario is being addressed, this particular slide or these particular pictures actually very much show where the major risks and also uncertainties are. And that has everything to do with global oil and natural gas demand in the various scenarios. So what you see here on the left-hand side are the various scenarios as far as oil demand is concerned, but also oil supply. And on the right-hand side, you see natural gas. What you see here, a million barrels per day of oil, you see the stated policy scenario. So in fact, the business as usual scenario with stated policies implemented towards 2050, you see that actually we're in a world where the demand of oil is plateauing around 100 million barrels a day. That's where we are more or less now post-COVID. This particular line is the announced pledges scenario. So these are the pledges which have been announced during the Glasgow conference in autumn last year by virtually every country. And here you see actually this particular line is the net zero scenario I just addressed. What you also see here is the supply of oil without further investment. In green, you see the actual supply which is needed in order to meet this almost 30 million barrels of oil by 2050, which is existing and approved as far as their investment is concerned. And if we follow the announced pledges scenario, then still by 2050, around 70 to 80 million barrels of oil are on demand. And that means that a lot of new investments need to be done. A similar sort of figure is given for natural gas as far as the, if you like, the end demand is concerned in 2050 for both the net zero scenario and the announced pledges scenario, and of course also the stated policy scenario as given. And as you can see that without further investment, actually all of those scenarios, well, definitely not the announced pledges scenarios, can be met. So dramatic different implications for investments. So a strong policy push to reduce oil and gas demand is key to minimize the risk of market tightening. And then the report, which is issued in December 2021, which was on oil and gas investment outlook by the EIF. And for those who are not familiar with the EIF, in fact, that is the group for both consumers and suppliers. So in fact, including OPEC, but also including the International Energy Agency countries, they jointly issued this particular report where they actually say that investment crisis is threatening energy security. And this was December 2021. And actually what it says is that there were concerns about the lower future investment, and that would potentially inflate prices. They reckon that upstream investment should be at least $525 billion at 2030 in order to balance, if you like, the market, but then also including a slowing demand growth. And what you see that the investment environment for oil and gas is, of course, very challenging at this moment in time in the face of risks like price volatility, as we see now, in evolving government regulations, increasing divergence of long-term demand narratives. And this is an important one. You have so many different scenarios. Which one is actually possibly the correct future line? And of course, the non-standardized ESG criteria, environment, social and governance criteria, which are so important these days on the stock market. All in all, also the International Energy Agency says there is a looming risk of more turbulence on the energy market. Again, this was the end of last year, or if you like, and there they actually put it in a slightly different framing. They said, listen, from a net zero scenario point of view, we reckon that the oil and gas production investment is nicely in line. That is this particular graph. If you look at the clean energy and infrastructure investment, there is still a long way to go towards 2030. So oil and gas investment is geared to a world of stagnant or falling demand. At least that's the scenario as far as net zero is concerned, while transition-related spending is not rising nearly fast enough. It is just a matter of packaging in the end of the day. But what you also see here on the left-hand graph is that, of course, the investment as far as oil and gas is concerned is relatively low, as also indicated by the IEF in my former, in the previous slide. But then if you then translate that into vulnerabilities as far as trade is concerned, this is also a picture from the International Energy Agency, where you see the value of international energy related trade now, okay, they took 2019 as their starting point, and how it would be in 2050 if we take the announced pledges scenario as a given, and on the right-hand side, 2050, according to the net zero carbon backcasting scenario. Well, the last one sees a lower amount of energy related trade, moving from 1.5 trillion to around 1.9. And then also what you see is this shift into what was used to be dominance of oil. Now oil 66%, in the announced pledges scenario around 58%. You see actually a rising importance as far as trade is concerned for critical minerals. And that of course has everything to do with the new energy technologies, critical minerals such as rare earth, cobalt, iridium, lithium, and what have you, which is all needed for new energy technologies. You see that coal definitely is going to be reduced in the announced pledges scenarios. Natural gas slightly reduced, but in the net zero carbon scenario, critical minerals will become, if you like, the most critical energy related trade by 2050. So a growing share of oil and natural gas for the announced pledges, especially towards Asia, and critical minerals and especially hydrogen-based fuels are on the rise in all scenarios, because we reckon here in the announced pledges scenario 7% towards 2050, and in the net zero scenario, very, very important, becoming, if you like, the molecule or the liquid type of energy trade of the future. All in all, energy security is in transition, but will it be orderly or will it be a disorderly transition? And that's, of course, extremely difficult to predict. But it looks like now, in where we are now and where we will be in the midterm, that it will be more than less volatility ahead. Some are economic, some are market-based, and some, especially now, are geopolitical. All in all, what you can say that by 2030, it's not so much the end state, which is of importance, but it's more the process, if you like, the road towards 2030 and later on 2050, which is far more interesting. Because what are we going to see? Most likely OPEC countries, they, in the end of the day, will be the most important entity, if you like, or group of countries to balance volatility in a market which will be more rather than less, at least as far as OPEC dependence is concerned. You see already now, and it becomes of course very, very clear now with the crisis in Ukraine, that EU dependence on in the European gas markets as far as Russia is concerned is a major concern which we want to move away from. As far as hydrogen is concerned, or green ammonia, those markets are still early days and they're not really liquid yet. And there are uncertainties with respect to vulnerabilities and disruptions as far as buyers is concerned. And of course, the critical mineral markets emerging, and definitely the dependence as far as dependence towards Russia, toward China is concerned, is something which should be addressed as well from a geopolitical and economic point of view. So affordability, reliability, security of supply and national security come, and this can be real or perceived, into conflict with climate ambitions. So will our climate ambition maybe wane because of this and because of the current crisis, or will actually be our climate ambitions be even more at the forefront because actually we have to accelerate as far as energy transition is concerned? But all in all, the market and policy tools are there eventually to de-risk the energy transition. The transition, as already said, is not straightforward. And here are maybe some more detail as far as this new world in terms of supply, demand, and pricing fundamentals. I already mentioned the supply deficit and the steep drop in capital expenditure, which changes the supply and demand equation. You see a supplier imbalance or balance. It very much looks, it depends on where you look from. OPEC's oil market share will actually change from 37% now to around 50% in 2050. Of course, there will be less consumed by then, but still the dependence is of course something to think about. Oil volatility and energy security risks will be with us at least in the next 10 years. The whole ESG focus, and that means that the ability for oil and gas companies to source capital is growing, and that has been seen as a risk. And of course, the whole decarbonization responsibility, and we only have to think about the court rulings, for instance, in Shell, and therefore shareholder activisms, maybe also for other oil companies in future, and should and will it include the scope 3 emissions as far as the responsibility towards the actual oil companies themselves. And I assume you know the difference between scope 1 and 2, which is in fact the upstream activities, but also the services they make use of, and then of course the scope 3 emissions, which is very much, if you like, the emissions which comes from the actual use of the product which is sold. Well, what does it mean actually for tank storage? I mean, Michel already mentioned that we have been active in providing some support towards the tank storage business, both in the Netherlands, but also in Europe. So VOTOP as well as FETSA. And we try to sketch, if you like, the tank storage's role in the different value chains. And this is an example from Vopak, and Vopak is a big Dutch tank storage company, where you see they are active in the value chain, in the different value chains, both for energy, for manufacturing, and for food and agriculture. So both new energy and feedstock, like for instance the future of as far as hydrogen is concerned, but maybe also CO2, gas and gas terminals. Vopak, for instance, together with Gasunie, has a huge gas terminal at Gate in Rotterdam, industrial terminals, chemical terminals, but also of course traditional oil terminals. And just to emphasize again what the role is of tank storage in today's global supply chain, actually it's fourfold. It's for this domestic consumption, so it supports the economic and geopolitical position of a country by fueling households, industries, and strategic assets like ports, airports, and military assets. And I used here the example of the Netherlands. Second, supporting regional industry. So because of the close proximity of tank storage to industrial centers, it enhances productivity and efficiency, for instance, on the energy side, edible oils, but also chemicals. Here I use the Northwestern situation as far as regional industry is concerned. Third, strategic storage, extremely important in this day and age with the current crisis. In Europe, tank storage is an essential part of the emergency response to logistics or geopolitical disruptions in energy supply, but also as military reserves for the European defense sector. And you all know that the International Energy Agency has recently also asked for emergency stocks to be released given the current crisis in the Ukraine. And last and not least is the international trade. I use here the example of the ARA ports, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp, they account for 77% of all the liquid bulk throughout in the region, say Rotterdam, Le Havre, and the tank storage also acts as a buffer in the market, which is which gives price stability and reduces uncertainty. So very, very important in the whole value chain, and not only energy, but also, as said, edible oils and chemicals. They are, as a sector, really standing at a crossroad. How will this rapidly changing global context of the energy world, which is changing, impact the actual tank storage sector? And so in the end of the day, they should also transform with this enormous transforming energy landscape by looking at the international value chain of fuels and chemicals, looking at the global energy transition and what are the decarbonizing policies and how will that affect their business. Emerging realities and accompanying innovations will require the sector to constantly adapt. So all in all, it's all about long-term strategy, but also to attract still, if you like, investors, not only for the longer term, but also for the next 10 years, where the actual fossil, if you like, value chains are still very dominant, if you like, in Europe. At the same time, long-term policies asks for new investments in, if you like, in new value chains, which are still very, very difficult to predict. So it's going to be an enormous, important and interesting new type of strategies they have to formulate in order to preserve the sector's profitability, but also their license to operate. Well, this is actually all I would like to say at this point as far as setting the scene. I hope I didn't talk too long, Michel, because that's one of my problems, but I think I did very well. You have to unmute, Michel. You have to unmute. Because we don't hear you. Now
It works, I guess, hopefully.
Yeah, now it works, yeah.
Thank you again, Lucia, for aligning us a bit further, and you sketch, well, some challenges indeed. We have to invest both in old and new, while at the same time transition at a speed never imagined before. So that's quite a challenge. I think that our next speaker, which is Ravi Bhattiani, who is the Executive Director of the Federation of European Tank Storage Associations, can, from his point of view, tell a bit more about this challenge, and especially because I think the sector itself is a facilitator of both supply and demand, and they not per definition are at the helm to steer the change, so to say. But I think Ravi, you can enlighten us a bit further on this one, please.
Thanks very much, Michel. I suppose you can hear me, right? Very good. So thanks for the invitation, and thanks also for the interesting speeches, comprehensive speeches, in fact, that we have heard so far today. A couple of words about FETSA, first of all. So FETSA represents the bulk liquid storage sector in Europe, and the terminals represented by FETSA are present in ports, airports, logistics platforms along rivers, canals, pipelines, and so on. And in total, the companies represented by FETSA are around 140, and these operate around 700 terminals across Europe. So it's a very comprehensive representation, I would say. Storage terminals themselves, Lucia went into it, but in summary, they're really an essential interface between sea, road, rail, inland waterway, and pipeline logistics. They are critical components in supply chains for liquid energy sources, but also in the healthcare industry, chemical industry, food security sector of food supply chains, because we're storing animal feeds, fats, oils, and so on. And essentially, the terminals help to balance out supply and demand, ensuring that everybody has the critical liquids at the time that they need them and in the quantity required. And this is really reflected in legislation, with storage terminals being viewed as critical national infrastructure by EU and national governments. So on the topic of the day, autonomy, and how does the storage contribute to this? For my entire lifetime, I'm 40 this year, we have lived in a relatively stable world and a relatively stable energy situation. And the energy system that we have had today managed the fall of the Soviet Union, 2 Gulf Wars, Middle East instability, plenty of natural disasters, and so on. And arguably, it managed the pandemic with the extreme demand shock that led to record low oil prices. But now it's coming under pressure, and that's for several reasons. I think most notably is the Russian war in Ukraine, but also the exit from COVID and another demand shock almost coming from that is happening. And at the same time, we have the energy transition really playing into the current mix. But the world now is almost more volatile than when I was growing up. It's probably one of its most volatile points. And it's because the world's dividing into blocks of democratic and non-democratic states and alliances. And with due respect to the histories, cultures, and technological powers of both of these blocks, they are frankly strategic or maybe systemic rivals that are currently clashing. And we're arriving at pace, real pace, into the energy transition with the urgent need to face climate change. So with these two macro trends in mind, it informs a little bit the views of FETSA and this intervention, because it's precisely in times of volatility that the EU needs its own autonomy of action in foreign policy, notably, but also autonomy in economic policy and, of course, in energy policy, because they're so interlinked. And storage plays a role here. As Lucia mentioned, it is a buffer, it's a reserve, and in fact, storage of energy carriers means that storage sector is really a social safety net as well, because energy security is a social issue at the end of the day. So in a stable environment that's characterized much of the recent past, if there is an energy crisis, we could have always, and we did, tapped spot markets to solve the crisis. And this was decided by policymakers some time ago, especially in the gas area, to be the solution. For example, for a strategic gas reserve, we never had really a strategic gas reserve because we could tap the spot markets. To an extent, it was also part of a solution for oil-related issues, because before strategic reserves tended to be released, countries and companies could tap the spot markets for the trade that they needed. And that's really a traditional free market approach. I'm one of the most free market people you can meet, so normally you cannot argue with, I cannot argue with that. But we see clearly today in the current volatility that the market-based approach is not working very well because it's under extreme stress. For example, trying to remove a major producer of oil and gas from the market is not something that the market can absorb very easily. And so we see some severe strains in the market with real risks of shortages of certain essential energy products, with the follow-on impacts on social unrest, economic damage, and so on. So what do we do if there's a market failure? If there is a market failure, which we probably have today, with potential interruptions to supplies, you need a public intervention. And we're starting to see it with the Repower EU policy package, gas storage minimum obligations, nationalizations of energy infrastructure, particularly gas storage infrastructure, IEA mandated releases. But I think we even have to go beyond this. Essentially, what we need is a consistent policy framework for planning the existing as well as the future energy carriers that are essential to the economy and economic stability. Because consistent policies can lead to a consistent investment environment, and we need this to attract outside capital. Hopefully the EU taxonomy is adapted to storage of the future energy carriers as well in this context. And we need appropriate regulation to ensure energy security through having appropriate mandatory strategic stocks, including strategic stocks of future energy carriers, because there is obviously a time lag between needing these stocks and the stocks having to be have the storage facilities developed. And we shouldn't even stop there. We probably need strategic stockpiles of critical liquids for the net zero economy. So when looking at autonomy and storage, I have a few conclusions. Strategic storage is really a prerequisite to enable EU freedom of action in foreign and economic policy. Clearly, 90 days has been insufficient for the volatile situation that we are in today, where the entire energy system is being shifted away from one producer. To contrast with the EU, during my research, I found out about Japan, and in January, Japan had approximately 240 days of strategic reserves. And that's more or less the time frame that national governments and the EU sees, I believe, for a phase out of Russian products. So maybe that is an indication of the level of strategic storage that you need to actually change your energy system in an emergency. And we have to have a level of certainty already today on the products that we want to stockpile in the future, including a view on who owns and controls these stockpiles. And this has to be done through an appropriate regulatory framework. And we have to be realistic about the volumes of products that are stored to make these stockpiles really of a strategic nature. We have to be wary about the reliability of producers and their ability to increase supplies at short notice, given the recent experience with OPEC Plus and the fracturing of the world into rival blocs. So essentially, my main message is that strategic storage is really essential, but for it to be meaningful, the strategic reserves have to be meaningful.
Okay.
Happy to answer any questions as we move on.
Thank you, Ravi. I think you made a clear point. Storage is important. It needs probably more storage and more diversified storage with regards to strategic stocks, especially future energy carriers, I think you mentioned, and a consistent planning framework, or you might even say a European energy transition roadmap with regards to storage, maybe, so that everybody has, well, has a clear view, and also maybe a plan to risk mitigation. With that in mind, I would suggest going to our next speaker, Martin Krastev. Martin is an experienced merger and acquisitions expert that has worked across energy and infrastructure sectors and spent some 40 years in the industry. And he is an investment manager, and now I think is heading the mergers and acquisitions department of IDCM Limited. So, Martin, maybe you can enlighten us a bit with your investment point of view with regard to strategic autonomy and storage.
Yeah, maybe very brief introduction on my side. I've been an investment banker for about 15 years now, based in London. Previously, I've worked for some of the bigger institutions. And last year, I joined a smaller firm where I'm helping to establish the M&A practice. As part of my job, I cover probably around 150, 170 investors. This, we're talking about both private and public institutions. And majority of these firms, these investors are investors in infrastructure. So, and when I say infrastructure, I really mean both energy, transport, and also digital infrastructure. And within the energy space, we cover everything from renewable energy up to oil and gas midstream and everything in between, including the regulated utilities and some of the non-regulated utilities. And so what do infrastructure investors like? How do they make investment decisions, right? So they like an asset which provides essential services. They like assets which operate within a robust contractual framework. So basically, either long-term contracts or regulated assets. So economically regulated assets by a government regulator. And they want to see stable and predictable cash flows. So this is what the infrastructure investors predominantly like. And how does the storage fit within this framework? But first of all, we need to clarify what we mean by storage, because storage is a very generic term, and storage of gas is very different from storage of crude oil. Storage of crude oil is very different from storage of refined products, for example, jet fuel or diesel or gasoline. And also storage of electricity is completely different animal. But in general, storage, why do we need storage? Why does storage exist in general? There are two purposes. The first one is to balance supply and demand misbalances. So these misbalances occur often, and they tend to be short-term. And then the second reason is security of supply. These are long-term issues, the long-term misbalances. A good example of a short-term supply-demand misbalance is when a very large ship, let's say a crude oil tanker, arrives at the port. They need to unload the cargo very quickly and go back to sea. The longer the ship stays at the port, the more expensive the shipping is, the cost of shipping. And therefore, what you usually tend to have is big storage facilities at ports where the ship can quickly unload the cargo and go back to sea. And then once this is done, then that cargo slowly and steadily is being moved to the destination, either through rail or a pipeline or a truck. This is a good example for short term. The long-term storage is obviously, there is some major shock in the system. It could be a war, but it could be something else. It could be, for example, an earthquake in a very important for the whatever commodity we're talking about area. So, for example, if there was an earthquake in the Middle East, that would significantly distort or some other natural disaster by that effect, it will have a big impact on the supply of the commodity, and therefore it's a good idea to have a long-term storage. Now, when we talk about oil storage or refined oil product storage, until probably 4 or 5 years ago, there was very strong demand of investors because investors clearly saw the reason of storage and the store, of crude oil and refined products. And this market was competitive, but operating usually within strong contractual frameworks, and therefore that part of the market did not need to be regulated. However, investors, especially infrastructure investors, became more and more ESG savvy. I mean, the United Nations introduced their SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. The investors in the infrastructure investors, in the private equity funds and the infrastructure funds, and also the investors, the different insurance companies and pension funds who tend to be the investors in the infra investors, the LPs in the private investors. They became more and more focused on these ESG goals or SDG goals, and therefore suddenly what we see in the market now is that storage for crude oil or storage for refined products, gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel or other products is now suddenly seen as a dirty investment. And I'm familiar with at least 2-3 deals on the market. So people who already invested in this asset and now the time is come to exit. I mean, they're struggling to exit because the interest in these facilities have gone down. At the same time, we see very significant interest in battery storage because now, everyone thinks, we're suddenly overnight going to electrify everything. And by everything, I mean, not just transport, but also our domestic heating systems. And also we are going to suddenly electrify also agriculture and in the industry by introducing hydrogen. And therefore, the demand for electric storage, electricity storage is gone up to the roof, which probably is true. And we see a lot of deals in the space. And these battery storage facilities, we see a lot of investors who invest in these projects without any government support, with no subsidies, with no regulatory framework, which is great. I mean, and this is what the industry needs. But at the same time, I completely agree with Lucia, what her presentation showed, which is that, for example, the demand for gas is most likely going to go up in the next 10 years before it starts going down. The market for refined oil products is quite interesting because the demand is declining and it's forecast, and I'm talking about Europe specifically, not globally, because the global dynamic is completely different. But in Europe specifically, the demand for gasoline, diesel, and other fuels is forecast to slowly but steadily decrease. But what's interesting is that the supply, the local output from the local refineries is declining in a faster pace. And therefore the demand for storage, so basically, what we're saying is we'll be importing a lot of these fuels, especially jet fuels, but some of the other fuels too. Therefore, the demand for storage of those fuels naturally increases. But at the same time, we see a funding gap because suddenly this, even though this is purely infrastructure and there is no dirty element to it, they've been, they basically have bad reputation at the moment because of, it's not an easy case to fit it into an investor's ESG or SDG investment criteria or an investment framework. I think this is where I went. I completely agree with Ravi's assessment. I mean, on the strategic storage, because most of the time, I spoke about the short-term storage. But in terms of long-term storage, the European Union has a directive requiring each member state to keep 90 days consumption into a long-term storage, and this is for crude oil, diesel, and gasoline. Now, clearly, the consumption of these products in normal times is different from the consumption of these products in war situation. And also 90-day storage. I mean, we've been, we are currently in, in month 3 of this war. And it's very obvious that 3 months is not sufficient to replace, long-term supply arrangements and, chains for this product. So I completely support also what Ravi said in terms of long-term storage, where it's very clear that governments need to increase the strategic storage minimum requirements.
Thank you, Martin. And well, the main takeaway is in terms of storage, there's an increasing need, but there's a lack of investment. So
I wouldn't say lack of investments.
Well, too little investment.
It has become more and more difficult, difficult to invest in storage than what it used to be before 3-4 years ago.
Yes, that's clear. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it's also a little bit of a shout out maybe to ask ourselves, okay, so what should be the policy then? How could we support the 3 things that Martin said? Investors are like essential services, but they need robust contractual frameworks and predictable cash flows. So, Carole, Mathieu, you're working as a research fellow at the IFRI's Center of Energy and Climate, and you're the head of the EU policies group there, and you studied science at Po Paris. So maybe you could shed light on the perspective so far from a policy perspective. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very interesting discussion. I mostly agree with everything that was said, and I try to complement the views. I try to be very, very brief. I think I'll focus on 3 aspects. First, I'll share some comments about the current situation, the energy crisis that we are facing. Complementing the excellent assessment that Lucia has done. Then I focus on the role of storage, and finally I try to share a few perspectives about policy responses. So first, what I wanted to stress is that maybe within the European context, we hoped for a gradual transition from imported fossil fuels to domestically produced zero carbon alternatives. Perhaps we hoped for a gradual progressive improvement in terms of our energy independence, of our strategic autonomy. And we suddenly realized that, in fact, our energy dependency has continuously grown. And in fact, it's reached the highest level in 30 years. And I think it's important to stress that, because it was in 2020, so before the crisis and the war in Ukraine. So we are today at 61% in terms of import dependency. And in 2020, we are spending 10% of our GDP on energy bills, whereas I think it's less than 5% in the US case. So I think it becomes very obvious to everyone that it's a serious weakness in terms of a strategic perspective, and also a serious economic weakness, competitiveness issue. The point, I think, is that we have made progress in terms of containing demand, improving energy efficiency. We've made progress in deploying low carbon options, but it has been much slower than the decline in our domestic production of fossil fuels, and especially gas. And it's what becomes very obvious today, because we are in troubled waters. We are still very much entrenched in the old world of fossil fuels. And yet we're not seeing the strategic benefits of our decarbonization efforts. And suddenly we realize how important storage is, of course, mostly gas storage, for the insurance, for the system and the market value that it provides. So today, what we are seeing on the EU front and at the member state level, everyone is doing a lot in terms of adjusting the policy framework. We are making the changes to ensure that finally the value of gas storage is properly recognized, properly captured by the regulatory framework. And we are setting this new set of regulatory rules, but this is very much a short-term response to a burning issue. And I think the next challenge is that we have to define a long-term storage strategy at the European level, beyond the question of gas storage, because if Europe is serious about, one, phasing out the dependency on Russian fossil fuels, and second, serious about its 2030 climate targets, then it's very clear that we will have to accelerate on many fronts, in particular the scaling up of renewables in the power sector. So we all know that the share of dispatchable power will decrease much faster than we thought. And on the other side, the electrification trend will also accelerate in transport, in industry, and probably in the heating sector. So I think this is no longer an issue for 2040, but perhaps an issue for 2030. And that is probably tomorrow in terms of industrial cycle perspectives. So I think this is where storage in various forms has a central role to play, of course, alongside other many technological options, such as demand response or interconnectors, but certainly it has to play a role. And I think today it's somehow the elephant in the room, because we know that it will be essential for building this sustainable and resilient energy system. But today, if you look at the energy market design, it's not really enabling decarbonized storage to thrive and the operators to really create a serious business model and monetize their services. I think we've stressed the developments on the battery front, yes, but at the same time, if you look at the perspectives for storage, they are much more attractive, let's say in the US case or in Australia, not yet in Europe, perhaps because so far we have enjoyed a very meshed network, very few issues in terms of flexibility needs. But I think the situation is changing much faster than we thought. So I think we have to recognize that today Europe is not sufficiently supporting the industrial dynamic around storage in various forms. And I think it's becoming a concern in terms of strategic autonomy. I just wanted to draw the attention to the US case, because there you have the Department of Energy, which has adopted a comprehensive energy storage strategy that was at the end of 2020. And it's not just looking at lithium-ion batteries. It covers a much wider set of technologies, and I think there's an interesting focus on long-term duration storage. So it's about supporting R&D, but it's also about supporting the manufacturing scale-up within the US territory, about securing the supply chains and becoming competitive internationally. So it's a very broad strategy covering many different aspects and not just the market design. Now, if we have a quick look at the first Repower EU plan, so the one published in March, you see that there's little on the role of storage. There's a lot about scaling up the production of green hydrogen, for example, but very little on our flexibility and storage needs. And I think this is something that we have to improve, perhaps in the second draft of Repower EU or later on. But if I could make just one recommendation, it would be to elaborate an EU storage strategy, a very political document, perhaps a communication from the European Commission at the start, just like we did for offshore wind and hydrogen. Because I think it would help identify the needs, recognize it as a priority, political priority, and then from this starting point, you could have member states developing their own roadmaps, and you could see the European legislators adjusting the policy framework on various fronts. So I think it would be an important way to kickstart this important discussion, which somehow has been neglected. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And indeed, you say it's a political choice or a necessity even to put it higher on the agendas, to also give some certainty to investors, to the sector itself. And you give us a nice suggestion to also look at the United States and how they proceed this topic. Thank you so much. Nice takeaways. Yeah, so I think we now having two other speakers, starting with Witske van der Meij. Witske is the of the Netherlands Ministry of Economic Affairs, and she's a member team of the Directorate on top sectors and industry policy. And I think, Witske, that from your point of view, you might allude a little bit to the discussion in terms of what you see as important, or maybe the initiatives already underway to help out in the energy transition in this way. So please, Witske, the floor is yours, and hopefully the sound works now.
Yes, thank you very much, Michel. You can hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's very good. Well, let me start by thanking you for the invitation to speak at this seminar, and also for the interesting presentations of the previous speakers. It's very good to be here to discuss the important issue of the energy storage and the strategic autonomy with all of you. Storage and logistics are crucial in the energy and feedstock system of the future. And I would like to compliment you with the VOTOP HCSS report. It's very good to have the knowledge of the report and to be prepared for the future with this knowledge. Let me start by saying a few things about Dutch climate policy. The Netherlands has a climate policy on the basis of the climate agreement, as you all know, I suppose. Decarbonization strategies and policies for the industry transition are necessary. And we want to move away from fossil resources as soon as possible. And we want to support first movers and newcomers in doing so. Climate policy leads also to challenges and opportunities for tank storage companies. And the list of fossil energy products in your paper should become shorter, and green products will be the growing markets. And the mission should be CO2 reduction by 2030, while safeguarding competitiveness and preventing leakage effects with the use of a proper mix of instruments. And there's a key message for 2050. And this is invest green here instead of grey elsewhere. And from a government point of view, there are some actions needed. Actually, there are quite a lot of actions needed. And there are 4 keywords for the actions. 1 is infrastructure, 2nd is innovation, 3rd is scale up, and the 4th is regulation. And there are also subsidies available to accelerate innovation, pilots and demos to drive down costs in the area of CCUS, green hydrogen, electrification, etc. Now let me refer to some recent policy objectives. Last Friday, the Minister for Climate and Energy sent a letter to Parliament about the independence of Russian oil, coal and gas, while preserving security of supply. Maybe you've seen the letter, I don't know, but some of the highlights are the cabinet wants to become independent from Russian fossil fuels by the end of this year. And the Netherlands therefore makes an active national and European effort to reduce dependence on fossil fuels in general and Russian fuels in particular, as quickly as safely possible while preserving security of supply. And the government wants to achieve this goal by focusing in the first place on energy savings and by accelerating the energy transition. And in addition, in the short term, it's still necessary to use fossil alternatives to Russian fossil fuels. Fossil for fossil. The import of Russian coal will be phased out completely within 4 months, partly due to the 5th sanctions package in the Netherlands and the rest of Europe. For gas, the infrastructure will be created this year, with which a quantity of LNG can be imported to replace the share of Russian gas. And for oil, the Netherlands will aim in the coming weeks to make agreements with the EU for becoming independent from Russian oil as soon as possible, preferably this year, while maintaining sufficient security of supply. And like other member states, the Netherlands is prepared for an interruption of serious disruption of the gas supply and has an emergency plan ready for this, and it's the so-called Gas Protection and Recovery Plan. And a number of member states have now announced the first phase of their emergency plan for various reasons. But because the Netherlands is in a different position than those member states, this step has not yet been necessary in the Netherlands. However, the energy markets are still characterized by great uncertainty and resulting in high prices. And then some words about the topic of open strategic autonomy. The issue of the open strategic autonomy in Europe has been urgent for some time, but it has come to the fore as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, especially in the energy domain. And we speak of open strategic autonomy as a means to properly safeguard our interests now and in the longer term. And this requires customization, and we are and remain open to international cooperation, investment and exchange. And the reduction of strategic dependencies can be done in various ways, such as building up your own stocks, finding alternative suppliers, but also by reducing the use of fossil fuels, for example. And it is especially important that we tackle this together. The chains are too closely intertwined for the Netherlands itself to have to carry the solution. The EU must do this jointly in order to also strengthen the European position in the future. Now, let me turn to some challenges and opportunities for tank storage companies. CO2 reduction and profit can be achieved through more energy efficiency, roof insulation, for instance, or tank storage, electrification. As you might know, one heated tank without roof insulation uses as much energy as 300 households per year for heating. And if this tank has roof insulation, that would be half. So creating sustainable and competitive energy storage is a big challenge. Among other things, to make value chains sustainable. It sets requirements for supply chain management, and it is important to integrate IC2 solutions. Well, as I said, there are geopolitical challenges through the Ukraine crisis. Storage and reserves are more important now than ever for our strategic autonomy. And in the recent report, there were given very good recommendations about proactivity and long-term planning, transparency, leveraging existing capabilities, and on cooperation. So now let me end by thanking you again for the invitation to speak. I think there are still a lot of steps to be taken, and we hope to see good projects and initiatives of you and your companies in the future. And I think the best way forward is to work together on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Witske. Now you made a couple of points. Thank you for complimenting us on our report. Of course, but you mentioned two things I think that are important. That's one is on innovation and one on scaling up. I think that's something that indeed the Netherlands cannot do alone and the industry cannot do alone. So that nicely intersects, I think, with what Carola already said. And maybe Thor, our last speaker before we end up doing a bit of more discussion on the topic, is maybe also able to show a bit more on what the plans are of the Commission. Thor is from Estonia and he's the advisor to the EU Commissioner on Energy, Kadri Simpson. And he's at the heart of the European Energy Transition Policy group, I would say. So Thor, maybe from your perspective, you could wrap it all up and tell us what's going on and what we should do.
Thank you, Michel. I hope the audio works. Quick nod is appreciated. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I would like to start by putting a little bit of context around this discussion. I've read your report, the freshly published report, and I've noticed one change that you've had to make when you finalized the work on substance in March, and then had to introduce a new preface saying that history has changed and we need to update our understanding about how the energy politics of the world work. And this reminded me of something. We are now 26th of April, which is the 36th anniversary of the Chernobyl catastrophe. At the time, there was a book written that has made a mark on the social sciences by the author Ulrich Beck, a German social philosopher. And he had written a book about how the world had changed, that we used to come from a situation of distribution of wealth or goods, and we enter an era of distributing the bad, the risks. So the book is called Risk Society, and he had to write a new preface after the Chernobyl disaster had taken place. So it's a pretty grim analogy, but that describes the situation where we're at for now. So many things have changed. We discussed, Michel, with you and colleagues right before the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and we now have to rewrite and rethink our approach to the energy politics. So undoubtedly, the security of supply is on top of our agenda, and the immediate response that we've given from Brussels, from the European Commission side, has been already mentioned. The Repower EU plan from March, which will get the second phase of analysis and proposals later next month, because we can set the political aims to give up the fossil fuels from Russia by 2027 and to cut the dependence on gas by 2/3 by the end of this year before the next heating season. But this takes a lot of, there is a lot of practical challenges how to deliver that. I do want to point out the element already raised in the discussion that we need to distinguish between different energy carriers and storage needs related to them. So indeed, there is a seasonal fluctuation on the gas demand side from perhaps 200 terawatt hours monthly consumption to 600 terawatt hours monthly, depending on the season. And if you compare these figures to the power market, then you almost see a flat line of 200 terawatt hours consumed there. But if you zoom in, of course, then you see the daily fluctuations, the hourly rather fluctuations on the electricity side. And the region, the Netherlands, for sure, have even these days seen negative electricity prices, and there is a completely new investment opportunity out there to be grasped. The industry has estimated that 2 years ago, in the year 2020, not estimated, but these hours have been counted, that there were already 1,800 hours of negative prices across the EU power markets in that 1 year. We look at the hottest of political discussions at the moment in Europe, in Spain, concerning the electricity prices, and we see a country which has a power market that still also fluctuates from single digit per euro megawatt hour prices to 200, 250, 300 euros per megawatt hour. And this is an opportunity not to be missed by the flexibility and storage service providers. I think another avenue where you can benefit from looking at different fluctuation patterns of consumption of different energy carriers is also going back to the basics. We've come into this mandate with the Energy Commissioner proposing to look at the energy system as a whole. So energy system integration strategy still holds true. And how much these different energy carriers and distinct flexibilities that they offer, how they can compensate one another is a big question that the industry, the stakeholders, the political discussion can answer. Coordination indeed is important. Looking at this year, and as I've pointed out, moving towards next heating season, looking at the infrastructure map of Europe, you can even see it behind me on the wall. Looking at the infrastructure that we have, we are also tackling another crucial aspect, which is the coordination to make use of this infrastructure. That all the pipelines and storage facilities really need to work together to provide a maximum impact in the stress situation. The analysis shows that we need the full capacity of the available infrastructure to be able to guarantee the security of supply during the peak consumption periods. And I would like to, and this coordination necessity, of course, also refers to bargaining power towards the global suppliers of those energy carriers that we are talking about. That the infrastructure needs to be filled with a product, and the current situation of stress to energy systems cannot result in more national approach to security of supply, but really relying on each other's support and infrastructure capacity and access to different fuels. My final remark for an introduction is that the question about decarbonization is valid. We should not overlook this this element in our outlook towards 2030, 2050, or the more short-term outlook towards next winter and the heating season. And we clearly see that the imported fossil fuels are very costly, and the way to get out of this costly deal is to invest in renewables, which takes time, but then also to be serious about energy savings. That takes less time. And if you look at the repower plan that we have already communicated in March, then you will see that that the energy savings potential is one of the top, let's say, avenues or options if we need to rapidly cut down the Russian fossil fuel imports. So I don't know how to put it, but these two targets, security of supply and the difficult stress that is faced by the energy system and the decarbonization goals, are completely compatible. Thank you.
Thank you, Thor. Yeah, so you also give an opportunity in saying, hey, the benefits of fluctuations is an opportunity for markets. That's, I think, specifically targeted to the electricity market, but still, if you look at the overall EU energy consumption, a large part is still not about electricity. So the question maybe to the rest of the panelists as well is and let me start with an observation, is that we on the one hand see that there is an ongoing demand still for, say, traditional energy carriers. And in terms of storage, there's still this need, and even maybe a bit more, as Martin already alluded to. At the same time, you see a lot of innovations taking place, but they are in early stages and not at, say, industrial scales yet for a lot of the new energy carrier options, which also means that there's a lot of need for investment there and also for storage. But it seems like there is a bit of it's a bit of a collective action problem. So what I think who made that point, I think it was Ravi, or it was the sorry, I'm missing out on this one, who really said it, that that the market as such can't solve it by its own, and especially if you look at tank storage, they're a facilitator of both supply and demand, but they are facilitators, so they have a service and are not the ones that are able to proactively change the system by themselves. So there needs to be a kind of editor of the system to make this all work. Maybe for you, back to you, Ravi, as a start. Could you reflect a bit on what's being said and where you see that the opportunity, or no, the solution is found in this case?
I think it's quite a difficult task, but I would like to go back to the point I made about perhaps I can describe it as a policy continuity. Torsten made precisely the point that there is policy continuity since the beginning of the mandate. But from what I really witness over the last 10 years or so is that we have seen nuclear being proposed as the solution for the future. We have seen gas being proposed as the transition fuel. We see nuclear then being said to be something that has to be got rid of at all costs. We see gas then being said as something that we have to get rid of, and electrification is the future. We see at various points throughout the last 40 years that we should invest in hydrogen, we shouldn't invest in hydrogen, we should invest in hydrogen. And now we see essentially a return to burning coal in member states to be an important part of the energy mix. So this is not really consistent, how can I describe it, a consistent line of or consistent structure to the European energy mix that is needed to plan storage investments, because we see many switches. And overall, we are obviously well aware and support the 2030 targets and the 2050 targets, but to ensure investments are freed up for or investments flow into tank storage companies to make sure that we can provide the infrastructure to meet those targets, we have to at the same time ensure that there can be investments to have a continuity of the system through renovating, upgrading storage facilities for fossil fuels. Given that, particularly for LNG imports, there are going to be new investments needed. The return on investment for an LNG facility might be 25 to 30 years. In 25 to 30 years, we're supposed to be at net zero. So there's kind of there's not a real incentive, or there's certainly not a market incentive to invest in some fossil fuel infrastructure. And part of this is because there's simply instability in the products that we are asked by customers to store, and there's a kind of instability in the legal frameworks. So if we take the Oil Stocks Directive, for example, we have this 90 days obligation. The Oil Stocks Directive is being reviewed. But I think the result of the review process will be something completely different now compared to what the result of the review process would have been had the Ukraine situation not arisen. But it just shows there's kind of a volatility in policy making, but that's not in any way the fault of the policymakers. It's driven by a volatile environment, and it's something we have to get used to. But there's a role for, let's say, regulatory intervention to at least stabilize the path to where we want to get to. And we see it with the Fit for 55 implementation and so on. But I think there's just a general point, Michelle.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. Maybe back to our introducer, Lucia. You heard the various takeaways that all the speakers were given, and maybe you could point out one or two points that you think are of interest and should be taken into account in the solution towards the future.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I thought the remarks were all very interesting, and I also like to be critical here. On one hand, we heard from an investor point of view that yes, they would like to invest, and especially into new products, if you like, because also of the ESG, the ESG growth as far as investors is concerned. I have not heard from the investor, you know, how far they eventually would like to help out, if you like, keeping the old infrastructure, at least for the next decades, in shape, and therefore helping out the business in order to keep that in shape, simply because that particular system will still be with us for quite some time. So that's maybe a question I have, because otherwise you really let industry, you know, very much in the cold there. Secondly, what I noticed, especially when I heard the policymakers talking, both the Dutch and the European, is that they very much echo what obviously we hear in the press as far as policy making is concerned. I do not hear any, if you like, yes, I hear obviously the short-term security of supply issues which have been addressed, but especially this time between now and 2030, when you have these two systems very much sort of, well, one still very dominant being fossil and the other one still have to be built. And on the other hand, also that the actual system which has to be built, and I think it has already been mentioned, system integration, it will be extremely difficult, it will be very complex. And all in all, you know, how far is policy, whether it's EU or in this case the Dutch policy, is going to help out for this very critical, what I would say, industry which tank storage is, in order to help out as far as their, if you like, they're building towards a better future. And a better future, in the end of the day, I think we all agree, will be a net zero type of economy. Whether that will be 2050 or 2060 or 2070 remains to be seen, because as I've shown on my graphs, you know, the net zero path towards 2050 is not all very clear, or at least is not yet a clear pathway, let's call it like that. So I would like to ask Martin a question as far as investment. I mean, to be clear as far as investment is concerned, and I also would like to hear from policymakers, you know, how far in that next decade, you know, they actually acknowledge at least that this fossil system still needs to be maintained. And the tank storage business is such an important component of that.
Thank you. Yeah, Martin, can I give you the floor?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there is a clear difference between gas and oil. I think gas, pretty much the view is that it will transition from natural gas to hydrogen slowly, and in between, in fact, I think it will also have biogas would play a big role. I mean, we see anaerobic digestion as a technology of converting agricultural waste and energy crops into biogas as a very significant business, which, you know, is probably mature already. I wouldn't even say it's emerging. But in the long term, the gas infrastructure will slowly transition into hydrogen infrastructure, and the current investors in the current gas infrastructure, it's quite clear that they are making plans for the required investment to make this happen. In terms of oil infrastructure, mainly, you know, petrochemical storage, this is more challenging. The existing investors in the space, they're obviously making the minimum required investments to facilitate transition to the various biofuels, liquid biofuels, which often requires basically converting a tank from let's say from diesel or gasoline into a biofuel. But I mean, the case for building a new storage terminal or storage terminal is increasingly more challenging. Also, there's a bit of a risk, at least at the moment, there's a bit of a risk of a stranded asset. So I think just judging from the current deals on the market, various terminals being sold and not being able to attract interest, I think in a short term, current owners who own oil infrastructure, if they need to exit, that may be an issue. And if this is the case, then obviously there's absolutely no incentive to put more money into the existing infrastructure. Some investors who are long-term investors, who can hold the assets in the next 10 years, beyond 2030, let's say, they may see this current environment, they can see it through. They may have gone through a phase where now all of the storage facilities are converted to some form of biomass, renewable liquid fuel storage, in which case, hopefully, their exit would be easier than what it is now. But at the moment, the market is very challenging. There's no question about this. And the worst thing for an investor is not, basically lack of liquidity. What's liquidity? How easy is it for you to exit the current position? And the liquidity in whether it's crude oil or refined oil product storage is challenging, at least, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So, then maybe either to Tor or Witske, how could policymakers help out in creating a situation where the investments are, well, less risk, let's say, or help out on the risk aversiveness of the investors to make this transition period more smooth and prevent all these price spikes and energy safety issues with populations? Is there an answer possible at this point in time? Who could I give the floor? Witske, you first, maybe?
Yes, that's okay, Michelle. Thank you. Yes, because I think Lucia made a very good point in stating that there are two systems at the same time at this moment. And as I would like to say, in the short term, it's still necessary to use the fossil fuels. And also when you're looking for alternatives for Russian fossil fuels, you still need fossil fuels for the short term. And that's also simply because, for example, the cars we all use run on fossil fuels. So that's why we have the two systems at the same time. The other side of the system is investing in renewables, investing in the new systems, in the non-fossil systems. And here's a role for government, I think, alongside with the industry, of course. And the role of government is like investing in infrastructure, the hydrogen backbones we are investing in the Netherlands, for instance, I think is a good example of this. And also investing in innovation and research and development. There are lots and lots of programs in the Dutch government which grants subsidies for innovation and research and development, and also scaling up businesses, ideas, demos, pilots. And the last thing, and maybe the most important thing for government to do, is adjusting regulation. For instance, the directives on RED 2 and RED 3. I think these are important things to do for government.
Okay, thank you. And in doing that, and especially the last two, you create more stable long-term perspectives for industry. That's basically what you make.
Yes, I hope so. Yes, I hope so.
Okay, okay. Tor, maybe?
Yes, and I'm in a very comfortable situation that by the EU treaties, I'm sorry, I don't have a mandate to promote fossil fuels, but energy efficiency and renewables. But we do take a realistic approach towards the energy system, and the modeling towards 2030 and 2050 by the European Commission is available, and you can see the role that we see for the fossil fuels and how quickly it can be replaced with alternatives. The most active line of work, of course, is the gas market, and we do understand hydrogen will play a role, hopefully by 2030. We have adopted the language of speaking in BCM, in the billions of cubic meters, and then up to 1/3 of the Russian gas imports, the equivalent to 1/3, perhaps could be replaced by hydrogen. But indeed, there are much quicker ways of replacing those BCMs coming from Russia with the LNG imports. And again, we need to guarantee that we are able to negotiate on this global market, and we have the infrastructure in the EU, because I would again like to stress that we are reaching the maximum capacity of the infrastructure that we have at hand. And FSRU you can still find for a very high price before the next winter, but there is only that much that you can do infrastructure wise before the next winter. What I really appreciate is not forgetting about biogas, biomethane, on top of the synergy, the very natural synergy with the agricultural sector. There is a huge potential. There is basically an endless potential of municipal waste as well, and existing technology. We only do understand, of course, that the opportunity to scale up to an industrial scale production is a bit of a challenge, given its very local nature. Bouncing back one question to the industry perhaps, and to the investors. If markets are facing volatility, if volatility is name of the game, then why isn't storage that you store when it's the price is low, and you distribute when the prices are high? Why hasn't this given a boost to the business model of different storage service providers? I know the answers, some of them, but would like to hear your views also about the investment possibilities against the market, which is volatile because of temporary events. But the forecast that we see is also beyond these temporary events for the volatility to remain. So let's put it in a neutral way, the question: if volatility is the name of the game, what how do you see the business model and the investment climate in that context? Last but not least, of course, we've taken our we need to do our work on the regulatory and legislative side as well. The gas storage obligations proposal is out there for stakeholders and member states discussion for immediate effect before the next winter, and we continue to analyze the security of supply, very short-term situation included, to be able to react more or less immediately. I mean, the normal legislative cycle is something that we cannot even afford these days when it comes to the crucial indeed outlook of severe curtailments. Then we need to act quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Tor. Before going over to you, Ravi, I think it's so as an intermediate, because Carol is also studying EU policies with regard to energy storage. She might reflect first on what Witske and Tor said, and then maybe hand over to give Ravi the last words, so to say, on responding to Tor's question, and then I'll try to wrap up because we enter, say, some 8 minutes towards 5 o'clock, which I'd like to see as the deadline, please. So, Carol, if it's up to you, what would you recommend from a policy perspective?
But first, I want to say that the task of policymakers is not an easy one, because on the one hand, listening to the investors, you clearly understand that you need a stable and regulatory environment, stable contracts, stable revenue streams, and of course it's fully understandable. So one answer could be to do more in terms of energy system planning, but on the other hand, quickly you will realize that the game is quite open, and there are many solutions that are competing against one another within the storage family, but also taking storage in comparison to other options. So it's very complex, and defining a too rigid framework could actually not be counterproductive compared to our economic interests and our decarbonization strategy, because we need to minimize the costs, and we don't know the full answer. So that's where we are, but the problem is that we need to act, and we need to do something, and that's why I was thinking that if we can have an assessment about the role of storage today, and perhaps including the question about why investment is not going on as we expect, I mean, both in the fossil fuels area, but also in terms of electricity storage, because somehow prices are very volatile as well on wholesale markets, and you can ask whether the business case for electricity storage is there or not. And in fact, if you ask the operators, they tend to say no. I won't go into the details, but we still need some improvements there. So I think if we look at how it's working now, what are the constraints and what are our future needs, it will not be an exhaustive assessment of our needs, and it's only the evaluation that we can do today, maybe taking into account the Repower EU adjustments. But if we have this, and if we have a European view on that, then maybe we can implement the roadmap. It does not need to be legally binding. It's just a starting point, and from this starting point, then you can adjust the market design. You can have member states developing de-risking approach, including storage in their recovery plans or anything else that could come afterwards. So yeah, maybe it would help just starting by a political evaluation of where we are and where we want to be, and then we will see how the next steps can take place.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Nice. So I think Ravi, because you are representing storage here, you might do this a kind of wrap up and answer at the same time Thor's challenging question.
Yeah, sure. So I would like to answer the question of Torsten. And essentially, it's always important to remember that storage companies have no control over who wants to store something and when they want to store it. But the generally accepted situation in real life is that people store when the spot price is low and storage empties when the prices are high. Right now, the spot price is very high, so commercial storage is emptying rapidly. A solution proposed for gas to get gas companies to store when the price is high has been contracts for difference, because this de-risks the transaction. It guards against the future price being lower than today's spot price for gas companies. And for oil products, an intervention like this would be really a major market intervention, and it would have to be a political decision to come forward with such a de-risking mechanism. Government purchases of oil and oil products is another possible solution to increase storage levels, because governments are not really motivated by market forces, but rather political and social forces. But again, this would be a major intervention and a policy decision to be taken perhaps at EU level if it would be a joint procurement, or more likely at a national level if it's not a joint procurement issue. So to try and sum up the discussions today, which is very difficult, I think that overall strategic storage is something that is perhaps undervalued or not given sufficient attention at a policymaker level. I think if I look at all the participants today that are not policymakers, there's been a generalized call to look again at the important role of strategic storage and adjust volumes accordingly. I think the important signal from policymakers has been the willingness to collaborate as we go through the energy transition. The willingness to look at storage as one solution of many solutions to help economies and societies through the current volatile times. And I think the discussions today also show what an important role think tanks like the Hague Center for Strategic Studies play in bringing civil society and the private sector and governments together to precisely discuss these things, because no one side has the solution. It will be a collaborative and a cooperative effort between us all to educate each other and hopefully come to the right solutions that can help guide us through these very difficult and testing times.
Thank you, Ravi. Yeah, I'm not going to try to summarize it all, to be honest. The only thing that I can say is I think we only scratched the surface of the questions at hand. I do understand that it's difficult, it's not always clear, and in that sense it's I think a collective action problem, and the only way you can come over collective action is to sit together and work together, and not wait for the other to start moving. And that's the reason that I at the start of the discussion also said it might be necessary to come up with a kind of roadmap, because we now see a lot of energy plans and ambitions, but the way towards that ambition has a lot of hurdles, and so we have to define together, I think, a lot of in between smaller milestone steps to make this happen. We did not touch about electrification and the need for all kind of critical raw materials, which is a topic in itself. If you look at the requirements there, it's a huge task as well. So mining for critical raw materials, for example, in Europe, could be a topic in itself that we should discuss as well. But anyway, I think it was a quite fruitful and for me interesting discussion to hear about, and I'm not sure whether Rafi I'm allowed to say, but I think for the participants here, they're I think welcome to the tank storage the day you're organizing somewhere in June in Brussels. So I guess that that it's at some point open for some to maybe attend as well. Is that correct? I think Rafi, you're on mute.
Sorry, I lost the screen whilst I was looking for the link to the conference. It's 15th and 16th of June in Brussels. You can find the details at www.fetsa, so FETSA.eu, and you just click on annual conference and you'll get there.
Great. Well, thank you all. It's precisely 5 o'clock. So I'd like to thank you all for participating, and I hope you enjoyed the discussions. I did, and I thank you so much for contribution, and hope to see you again in another format, maybe to further take this discussion to the next levels, maybe. So thank you so much, and good evening.